As I entered the garden, Grace was carrying a large bag of soil from the cart. She bent down, her thin cotton shirt, loosely tied at the waist, sliding forward. In that moment, the wide collar opened, revealing the soft curve of her chest. No longer as full as when she was in her 20s, but still beautiful, gentle, and hard to look away. I stood there stunned. A wave of heat rushed straight to my face, my heart pounding. I knew I should turn away, and I did, but the image was imprinted in my mind, both embarrassing and stirring up a new emotion. Hello, my name is Ethan Parker. I am 23 years old. I have lived my whole life in a small town nestled between the pine forests and red dirt roads of North Carolina. Here, the summers are sweltering hot, the winters are bitterly cold, but the pace of life never changes. I wake up to the sound of roosters crowing from my neighbor's house and go to bed at night to the sound of crickets chirping on the porch. People say this place is peaceful, but for me, sometimes it is too peaceful to the point of suffocation. My job is nothing special. I work as a construction worker for a small crew in town. Every day, my clothes are covered in cement dust, my hands and feet are calloused from wood and nails, and my shoulders are always sore from carrying heavy materials. Honestly, this job is not glorious. It is not something to brag about on social media, but it pays the rent enough for dinner and enough gas for an old truck. I often hear people comment that I am impulsive. Maybe they are right. I rarely think ahead. I usually act on my emotions. But I like to call it courage. Courage to speak my mind. Courage to help others when they need it. Courage to not be afraid of making mistakes. Because mistakes can be corrected, that's all. However, there is still a void in my heart that is difficult to fill. A feeling of emptiness, as if I am waiting for something different to appear in this boring life. Perhaps it is that void that makes me pay attention to the house at the end of Willow Street, the house that everyone passing by has to turn to look at, not because it is big or luxurious. On the contrary, it is quite simple. The paint color has faded a bit over the years. But the front garden is always in full bloom, roses, lavender, daisies, each with a different color, blending together like a spring painting in the middle of a hot summer. I don't know who takes care of that garden. I only know that their hands are more patient and meticulous than anyone else in this town. I didn't expect the owner of that garden, and of the biggest changes in my life, to show up when I least expected it. The day began like any other. The sound of hammer saws and construction trucks rumbled down the small street. We had been hired to repair the roof of an old house right next to the house with the brilliant garden. I remember looking up between wiping the sweat from my brow and seeing the owner of the flower house for the first time. She was standing by the white picket fence, her wide-brimmed straw hat half covering her face, but not hiding her long, dark brown hair streaked with silver. The sunlight filtered through the trees, casting a soft, almost nostalgic glow on her features. She wasn't young, of course, maybe 50, but her eyes had a beauty I'd never seen before, deep, a little tired, but also strangely warm. They called her Grace Whitmore. I had heard vaguely she had lived alone for many years after her husband died, or left. No one was sure. Some whispered that she had a daughter, but had moved away. In any case, Grace still kept the most beautiful garden in the street, as if that was her way of fighting her own loneliness. That day, Grace went out to the garden to water the flowers. I pretended to concentrate on my work, but my eyes kept sneaking glances. Her every movement was slow and careful, just like the way she cared for each flower. There was a stillness in her appearance that made even the noise of the construction site seem to fade away. I didn't dare to talk to her. I just stood at a distance, wiping my sweat with the hem of my shirt, wondering why someone like her would be in such a dreary place. That afternoon, the weather was unusually hot. Gray clouds gathered in the distance, signaling the arrival of a late summer rain. My crew was hauling large planks from a truck to the construction site. Willow Street, usually quiet, was bustling with the sound of engines and people shouting as they carried materials. I was concentrating on carrying a long plank with my colleagues when I heard a dry crack. Immediately after, there was a loud crash against the white fence next to me. The wooden barrier tilted heavily towards the flower-filled garden. Das, ja. Damn, I blurted out, my breath coming in short gasps as I saw a section of Grace's fence snap. I quickly dropped the plank I was holding and ran over to investigate. On the other side of the fence, Grace had stepped onto the porch. She stopped her eyes on the broken piece of wood, then looked at me. Not angry, not complaining, just a tired look mixed with a little surprise. "Sorry. The fence was broken by our truck," I said, trying to keep my voice calm, but still showing a hint of worry. My voice was a little hoarse from working in the sun all day. Grace shook her head slightly, hugging her arms tightly, as if to reassure herself. "It's okay. It's just a fence." She replied, her voice low and deep-sounding, more like she was talking to herself than answering me. I stepped closer, bending down to examine the break. Several pieces of wood were loose splinters scattered across the lawn. "I can fix it right now. Just a few nails and a hammer," I said, then looked up at her for permission. She paused, her eyes slightly confused, but then nodded slightly. "If you don't mind." Her voice was slow, a little hesitant, as if she wasn't used to letting anyone into her space. I smiled reassuringly. "No problem. My name is Ethan. I just happened to meet you and wanted to help." I tried to smile gently, hoping to lighten the tension. "Grace," she said softly, then turned away as if afraid that my eyes would linger too long. We were silent for a few minutes, the only sound left being the hammering and the late afternoon insects. I got the wood from the construction truck, cut it to fit the fence, and called to Grace to hold one end of the board in place while I hammered in the nails. "Hold it tight," I said, a hint of urgency in my voice as I moved the board back into place. Grace nodded, her small but calloused hands cupping the end of the board. I held the other end. As we both lifted it, our fingers accidentally touched. Just for a moment, but enough to make my heart pound in my chest. Her hand was warm, but trembling. I, for some reason, felt my face burning. Grace pulled her hand back slightly, as if she had just touched something too private. "Sorry," she said softly, her voice almost a whisper. The tone of her voice left me momentarily confused, but also puzzled, as if it had awakened something inside me. "It's okay," I shook my head, smiling reassuringly. "Let me keep this part for you," I said quickly, as if to fill the long silence. We continued mending the fence in silence. I tried to concentrate on the work, but my mind kept returning to the moment our hands touched. It wasn't the kind of flutter I'd felt with the younger girls I'd known before. This was different, deep and hard to name. There was something about Grace, her calmness, her eyes filled with sadness, that made me want to protect her and understand her better. When the last fence was secured, I stepped back, wiping the sweat from my forehead. "I'll come back tomorrow to make it stronger." "Just a temporary fix for today," I said, my voice soft but firm. Grace looked at the newly erected fence, nodding slightly. "Thank you." "Ethan," she said this time, calling my name. Her voice was warmer, as if the distance between us had narrowed a little. I packed up my tools and returned to the construction site, but the image of her hand and her eyes, as she said sorry, still lingered in my mind. It was strange, just a small collision, but my heart was in turmoil all afternoon. That night, as I lay in bed, the sound of insects outside the window still buzzing, I couldn't stop thinking about the flowery garden and the woman with the sad eyes. I didn't know why I cared, but I was sure of one thing: I wanted to see her again. And perhaps this was the beginning of something I had never imagined. I didn't mean to eavesdrop, really. That afternoon we took an early break because it was starting to rain. Everyone in the team had gone home, leaving me alone to collect some leftover planks in the corner of the yard. As I passed Grace's house, I heard a voice coming from the half-open window, her voice deeper and more hoarse than usual. "No, I'm fine. The doctor says my heart can handle it. Just don't push myself too hard." I stopped, my heart pounding. "Heart disease. Don't worry about me, just live your life. I don't want to burden anyone." There was a soft sniffle. I swallowed. For a moment, I felt like the whole garden had gone silent, except for that choking sound. I shouldn't have listened, but my feet felt like they were nailed to the ground. She ended the call with a heavy sigh. Then there was silence. I backed away slightly, afraid that she would notice I was standing nearby. On the way home, my mind was racing. I wanted to do something, anything, but I knew that illness was a private matter. I couldn't just ask. But if I kept quiet, Would she continue to suffer alone? That night, the rain pounded on the roof. I lay awake thinking about Grace's sad eyes as she stood by the fence. It turned out that behind that calmness was a weak heart, both literally and figuratively. And for some reason that made me want to be closer to her. The next day, I used the excuse of checking the newly repaired fence to stop by. Grace was sitting on the steps, a cup of tea in her hand. The garden was filled with morning sunlight, yellow daisies swaying in the wind. "Good morning," I said, trying to keep my voice casual. My voice was a little boomy with nervousness. Grace looked up, nodding slightly. "Hello." "Ethan," she replied, her voice as light as the morning dew. I stepped forward, pretending to inspect the timbers. "The fence is fine, but I noticed the garden tap is leaking. If you want, I can fix it." I spoke moderately, avoiding the hint that I was looking for an excuse to help further. Grace frowned slightly, her eyes wary. "No need. I'm used to it," she said quietly, setting her teacup down on the steps. "It'll only take a few minutes," I added, trying to keep my voice light. "Besides, it's free. Think of it as making up for the time the truck broke the fence." I smiled half-jokingly, hoping to ease her tension. She was silent for a long moment, then sighed. "Whatever you want," Grace said, sounding like she had come to terms with herself. I quickly grabbed the toolbox. The tap was leaking more than I'd expected. The water dripped down, making the ground around the flowers damp. I knelt down to fix it, while Grace stood nearby watching, but saying nothing. The feeling of her standing behind me made me feel both pressured and strange. I could clearly hear her soft breathing, the faint scent of lavender from her shirt blowing in the wind. Every time I turned my head, our eyes met, and then quickly looked away. After fixing it, I tried turning on the faucet. The water flowed strong and steady. "Done," I said, looking at her with a small smile. Grace nodded slightly. "Thank you," she replied, her voice soft, but her eyes softer than before. I was about to leave, but noticed the old wooden swing in the corner of the garden creaking in the wind. "This one needs tightening the screws too," I blurted out. Grace was slightly surprised. "You saw it all right," she said, the corners of her lips twitching slightly, the first time I heard a hint of playfulness in her voice. "I do this job," I replied, laughing and rolling up my sleeves, feeling my heart lighten when I saw her smile for the first time. After I finished fixing the swing, I noticed that the mailbox on the front porch was also leaning its hinges almost undone. I looked up at Grace, waiting for her opinion. "This one's broken too," I said, pointing to the porch. My voice was soft, but I waited for a response. Grace stepped closer, looked at the mailbox, and sighed softly. "I guess it's time to fix it," she replied, her voice a mixture of helplessness and acceptance. I smiled and got to work. As I hammered in the nails, Grace stood beside me, her hand unconsciously touching the wooden frame of the fence that had been repaired the day before. The initial wariness had disappeared, and the atmosphere between us gradually warmed. No words were needed, just a quiet presence. When I finished, it was late afternoon. The sunset filtered through the trees, dyeing Grace's silver hair a warm copper color. She smiled slightly, a fleeting smile, but enough to make my heart stop. "Thank you, Ethan," she said softly, this time her voice much warmer. "It's nothing. I'd like to help," I replied, scratching the back of my neck in embarrassment. Grace said nothing, but her gaze at that moment was gentler than any thanks. The next day I returned under the pretext of checking the screws on the fence. Actually, I just wanted to see her. When I entered the garden, Grace was carrying a large bag of soil from the cart. She bent over her thin cotton shirt, tied loosely at the waist, sliding forward slightly. In that moment, the wide collar opened, revealing the soft curve of her chest. No longer as full as when she was in her 20s, but still beautiful, gentle, and hard to look away. I stood there stunned. A wave of heat rushed straight to my face, my heart pounding. I knew I should turn away, and I did, but the image was imprinted in my mind, both embarrassing and stirring up a new emotion. Grace looked up, catching my eyes that had just been avoiding her. She paused, but didn't blame me, just adjusted her shirt slightly and smiled slightly. A strange smile, a little shy, but also accepting. "This bag of soil is too heavy," she said, her voice tinged with a breath of exhaustion. "Let me hold it," I replied more quickly than I had intended, my voice hoarse with embarrassment. I stepped closer, my hand touching the bag of soil at the same time as hers. The feel of her skin against mine, warm, soft, made my heart race again. I tried to keep my composure, but my slightly trembling hand gave me away. Together we lifted the bag of soil and put it back in its place. When I was done, I stood still for a few seconds trying to catch my breath. Grace was silent too, her eyes avoiding the flowers, but the corners of her lips curling up slightly, as if she knew what was going on in my head but chose not to say it. That moment marked something that had changed. The feeling I felt was no longer just pity for a lonely woman. It had become a masculine vibration, confusing, profound, and making me want to be closer to her than ever. That night, when I returned to my room, I lay staring at the ceiling. The image of Grace bending over, her hair falling sideways, and her curves peeking out in the afternoon sun kept playing over and over in my mind. I was both ashamed of the feeling and unable to deny it. For the first time, I truly wanted to know this woman, not just with my heart, but with my own vibrations. That afternoon, the sky was overcast. The clouds were thick and thick on Willow Street. I had just finished a long, tiring day at work, but I felt like stopping by Grace's house for no apparent reason. As I reached the gate, I heard the sound of metal falling and heavy breathing from the yard. My heart sank. I quickly pushed the gate open and ran inside, and the sight before me scared the hell out of me. Grace was kneeling beside the fallen shovel, one hand clutching her chest, the other supporting herself on the grass. Her face was pale sweat, beading on her temples. "Grace," I shouted, my voice shaking with panic. She tried to look up, her lips moving. "I'm fine." Her voice was broken, as if she had no strength left. "No, you're not." I knelt down beside her, one hand supporting her shoulder, the other reaching for the phone to call 911. My voice was shaky but firm as I spoke to the operator, giving the address and the patient's condition. While waiting for the ambulance, I pulled Grace into the shade under the porch. Her heart was beating fast and erratic, her breathing was shallow. I held her hand tightly, trying to reassure her, "Just take a deep breath. I'm here." My voice was soft but urgent, hoping she would hear it through the shock. Grace nodded slightly, tears welling in her eyes. "I don't want anyone to know about this," she whispered, her voice breaking. "It's too late," I replied, squeezing her hand gently. "The important thing now is to keep you safe." My voice was low but determined, as if to ease my own fear. The ambulance siren sounded in the distance. A few minutes later, a nurse appeared and put Grace on a stretcher. I ran after her, thinking of nothing but being with her. In the white hospital room, the strong smell of disinfectant. Grace lay silently, an IV in her arm. When the doctor left, I pulled up a chair and sat down next to the bed. She opened her eyes and looked at me. They were weak, but still as deep as the first time I saw them. "Why are you still here?" Her voice was hoarse. "Do you think I can leave?" I asked again, forcing a small smile despite my panic. Grace turned away, her gaze directed toward the window. "I don't want anyone to worry about me. My heart is very weak, Ethan." The doctor said, "I'm not sure how much longer." Her voice trailed off. Then she fell silent. I took her hand gently but firmly. "You don't have to go through this alone," I said, slowly, each word clear. "I'll be here, no matter what." Grace looked at me, her eyes moist. She shook her head slightly, forcing a smile. "You're young. Don't waste your time on someone like me." "Don't say that," I replied immediately, my voice a little harsh with emotion. "Age doesn't matter. What matters is, I want to be here. I want to be with you." In that moment, I didn't know what the future held, only that I couldn't turn away. And when her hand gently squeezed mine, I knew she had tacitly accepted my presence, at least for now. Grace was discharged a few days later. The doctor told her to avoid exertion, but I knew she would be sad if she just sat there doing nothing. So I came up with an idea: rebuild the garden the way she had dreamed it would be. A beautiful, soothing place for her to enjoy every day. "You said you wanted more sunflowers and lavender, right?" I asked as I drove her home. My voice was excited, hoping she would agree. Grace was slightly surprised. "You remember?" she asked, her lips curving slightly, her eyes softening. "I remember everything," I replied, my voice firm. I want to make it happen for you." At first, Grace objected, telling me not to bother. But after a few persuasions, she finally agreed to join in, just standing there, giving instructions, letting me do the heavy work. In the following days, we spent time together in the garden. I dug the soil, mixed the fertilizer, and Grace sat on a wooden chair, occasionally pointing out what flowers to plant. The early summer sunlight painted her hair golden, making the silver strands sparkle like thin silk threads. One afternoon, as I carried a large pot of soil, Grace stood up to help. "You don't have to do it all by yourself," she said, her voice tinged with guilt. "I'm used to it," I replied, smiling lightly, still holding the pot tightly. "At least let me hold it for you," she said, and stepped forward. We lifted the pot together, but as soon as we lifted it, Grace's foot slipped on a small stone. She lost her balance, and her body tilted backwards. "Grace," I exclaimed, letting go of the pot of soil, reflexively reaching out to hug her. I wrapped my arms around her back, her whole body falling against my chest. In that moment, I could feel my heart pounding and her hot breath on my neck. The scent of lavender from her hair mixed with the scent of the earth and the afternoon sun, an unforgettable scent. Grace was confused, her eyes widening as she realized the distance between us was so close that she could feel every breath. Her face was only a few centimeters from mine, and in her eyes, for the first time, I saw something that was not just shy, but also excited. "Are you okay?" she stuttered, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm fine." "But you're not," I replied, still not letting go, my voice choked with fear and excitement. We stood like that for a few seconds, then both stepped back, avoiding each other's eyes. But I knew, and Grace must have known too, that moment had changed something. We were no longer just neighbors or helpers. Something new has crept in, deeper, more real. After that near fall, I was determined not to let Grace do anything heavy. But she insisted on joining in, at least planting and watering. We worked together day after day in the hot early summer sun and the cool afternoon breezes. I noticed one thing every time Grace smiled, even briefly. The garden seemed to light up. And every time she was silent, her eyes looking into the distance, I wanted to ask to dispel that quiet sadness. One afternoon, after finishing the last row of lavender, we stood back to look at the result, a long stretch of purple flowers interspersed with bright yellow sunflowers behind. "Beautiful," I exclaimed, my voice full of pride. Grace smiled softly, but sincerely. "You did something I could only dream of." "Not me," I said, looking at her. "We?" Grace turned, catching my eye. They were both silent for a few seconds, a silence that was not awkward, but meaningful. Then she nodded slightly, turned away, but I saw the corners of her lips curl up slightly. That garden was more than flowers. It was a testament to the change in the relationship, from strangers to close friends, from reserved to trusting. That night, Grace had to go back to the hospital for a routine checkup. The doctor wanted to keep her for a few days. She seemed sad, not because of the hospital, but because she missed the moment the garden was just finished. I didn't want her to be sad anymore, so I thought of something daring bring the garden, or at least the feeling of it, to the hospital. I secretly prepared a plaid blanket, a few small LED lights, a simple food basket, sandwiches, fruit, and 2 bottles of cold lemonade. I didn't tell Grace, just told her to come to the hospital's backyard that night. When she appeared wearing a thin gray sweater and a light scarf, I almost held my breath. Under the dim yellow light of the hospital yard, she was still beautiful, a mature, peaceful beauty that made people want to look at her forever. "What are you doing here?" Grace asked, her voice mixed with surprise and curiosity. "I invited you to a picnic," I replied, spreading the blanket on the grass. My voice was a little nervous, but I tried to keep calm. Grace laughed softly, a rare laugh that I loved so much. "In the hospital yard," she asked, her eyes shining with joy. "Where there are stars, there are picnics," I replied, sitting down, my voice deliberately humorous. She slowly sat next to me. I opened my basket and handed her a ripe red strawberry. She took it, bit it lightly, her lips slightly tinged with red. At that moment, I had to turn away so that my eyes would not reveal all my emotions. The night sky was clear. The North Carolina sky was vast and starry. We lay side by side on the blanket, silently gazing at the sky for a long time. "It's been a long time since I've seen stars, this beautiful Grace," whispered her voice like a passing night wind. "Me too," I replied softly, "but it must be more beautiful with you lying next to me." Grace turned to look at me, her eyes filled with surprise but not reproach. There was only silence, and in that silence, my heart was beating so fast I could hear it. "Ethan." She called my name, her voice soft but deep. "Aren't you scared? Afraid of what I asked, still looking at the sky. Afraid of being attached to someone like me. Someone who has an uncertain future." She said, her voice trembling slightly. I turned my head, looking straight into her eyes. "I'm scared of one thing," I said slowly, each word clear. I was afraid to tell her I wanted to be with her, and then one day regret my silence. Grace was silent, but her eyes were wet. She turned to look at the sky, and I saw her hand move slightly closer to mine. I held my breath, then reached out too. Not to hold, just to keep it close. A very small distance. A current ran through it, light but clear. We lay like that, our hands not touching, but still feeling each other's warmth under the starry sky. For the first time, I realized what I felt for Grace was no longer pity or curiosity. It was love, real, deep, and undeniable. From that night under the stars, I knew things were different. We didn't need to say it, but the silence between Grace and I now contained more than words. I wanted to hold her hand. I wanted to hug her, and most importantly, I wanted her to know that I loved her. But from that day on, I began to see hesitation in Grace's eyes. She avoided looking at me for long, avoiding letting us be too close to each other. Sometimes I caught her quietly looking at the garden, and then quickly turning away when she realized I was looking. I couldn't stand this ambiguous distance. One afternoon, when the sun was about to set and the garden was dyed yellow, I decided to speak up. Grace was pruning withered flowers. Her long hair was tied loosely, a few silver strands flying in the wind. I walked over my hands, shaking slightly, but my heart was prepared. "Grace," I called softly. She looked up, those deep eyes, looking at me a bit surprised and wary. "What's the matter, Ethan?" Her voice was soft, but reserved. I swallowed, my heart beating fast. "I have something to tell you." I breathed, my eyes never leaving hers. Grace was silent, waiting. The sunset light fell on her face, softening the lines at the corners of her eyes, making them look so beautiful. It was heartbreaking. "I love you," I said, my voice soft but clear. "It's not pity. It's not temporary. It's real. I love you." The room fell silent. There was only the sound of the wind blowing through the lavender and the pounding of my heart. Grace shook her head slightly, smiling faintly, a smile that was more sad than happy. "Ethan, you're young. You don't understand," she said, her voice low and husky. "I know enough to know how I feel," I said immediately, my voice shaking with emotion. "You'll regret it," Grace added, putting down the scissors. "Someday, when you want a family, want children, want someone to be with you forever. I can't give you that. I can only give you grief." Her voice broke at the end of the sentence, as if she was trying to hold back tears. "I don't care about the distant future," I said, stepping closer. "I care about today. And today, I want to be with you." My voice was urgent, like a plea. Grace turned away, her shoulders shaking slightly. "Don't do this, Ethan," she whispered. "Don't make it difficult for me. I've lost too much. I can't bear to hurt you again." She turned to walk away. I grabbed her wrist gently, not hard, but enough to stop her. "You didn't hurt me," I said, my voice choked. "What hurts me is watching you push me away." Grace stopped but didn't turn to look at me. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely audible. "I can't." My hand slipped from her wrist. She walked away, her thin figure disappearing behind the door. I stood in the middle of the garden, feeling as if the world had gone silent. The lavender swayed in the wind, but I could no longer hear it. There was only emptiness, and a determination deeper than ever. I would not give up. No matter how many times she pushed me away, I was here. I would not let her face it all alone. From that day on, Grace almost disappeared from my life. She didn't reply to my messages, nor did she open the door when I stopped by. From afar, I could see her silhouette behind the curtains, but when I called her name, she quietly retreated inside. The garden we had been tending together began to wither. The lavender turned gray, the sunflowers bowed in the wind. Seeing it, I felt like everything we had built was dying. Not just the flowers, but something in my heart. Every night I passed by her house, hoping to see the kitchen light or a shadow in the window. But every time, there was only darkness. One night, I couldn't stand it anymore. The feeling of unease kept me from sleeping. It was drizzling outside, the wind whistling through the trees, the windows creaking like sighs. I put on my raincoat, walked out into the street, and headed straight for Grace's house. The gate of the fence was half closed. The lights in the house were off. I called her name. No answer. My heart was pounding. "Grace," I knocked harder, almost shouting. No answer. I pushed the door open. It was unlocked. Entering the house, I was almost stunned. Grace was sprawled on the living room floor, her face pale, her lips pale. "Grace." I rushed forward, kneeling beside her. "No, no, no." My voice was shaking, caught in my throat. I checked her breathing, weak but still. My heart felt like it was about to jump out of my chest. I called 911, my hands shaking so much I almost dropped the phone. "Emergency female patient, 50 history of heart disease. Unconscious, short of breath." I yelled into the phone, my voice cracking with panic. While waiting for the ambulance, I held her head in my lap. Rain dripped from my shirt onto her face, mixing with cold sweat. I whispered, my voice choked. "You can't leave me, okay? I haven't told you yet. I have to show you how much you deserve to be loved." My hand shook, squeezing hers. Not this time to feel the thrill, but to beg her to stay. A car horn sounded outside. The door swung open, and the paramedics rushed in. I helped them put Grace on a stretcher and ran after the ambulance. In the bright white car, I sat next to her, holding her hand tightly. Every time the monitor beeped, I gasped, praying it wouldn't stop. As the car sped away in the rain, I realized one thing: I was no longer outside this story. I had chosen to go in, no matter what the outcome. That night in the hospital waiting room, I sat alone. My clothes were soaked, my hands still shaking slightly. The smell of disinfectant, the sound of doctors' footsteps, the sound of machines, all blended into a distant noise. I thought of it all: the days in the garden, the picnic under the stars, the moment she avoided my eyes. And I knew I couldn't let go. No matter how many times Grace refused, no matter how much age or illness separated us, I wasn't going anywhere. When the doctor came out and said she was out of danger, I almost collapsed with relief. But at the same time, I knew something else. From now on, I would have to fight twice as hard, not just against her illness, but against the wall she had built around her heart. And I was ready. Grace lay in a white hospital room, the neon lights dim and cold. The heart monitor sounded like a clock, each beat blending with the sound of rain outside the window. I sat beside the bed, my arm resting on the metal bar, my eyes fixed on her face. Since I was admitted to the hospital, I had hardly left this place. During the day, I helped the nurses run errands. At night, I curled up on a plastic chair and took a few hours of sleep. People told me to go home and rest, but I couldn't, because every time I closed my eyes, I saw Grace collapsed on the floor that day. One early morning, when the first rays of sunlight filtered through the curtains, Grace opened her eyes. I woke up with a start. "You are still here?" Her voice was hoarse with fatigue. "Of course," I replied, standing up and walking closer. "Do you think I can leave you alone?" I tried to smile reassuringly, but my voice was still shaking. Grace looked at me for a few seconds and then turned back to the window. "I don't deserve this," she whispered. "I do," I replied, my voice soft but firm. We talked more in the days that followed, not just about my illness, but about my past and my secret fears. I learned that Grace had a broken marriage, a daughter who now lived in another state, and a heart that was too tired to love again. I told her about my poor childhood, about feeling lost in this town, and about the first time I saw her flower garden, where I felt I had found something I had been missing. One afternoon, when her temperature rose slightly, I used a wet towel to wipe the sweat from her forehead. When my hand touched her skin, warm but fragile, Grace flinched, then took my hand. I froze. Her hand was small and thin, but the grip was strong enough for me to feel her presence. She didn't look at me right away, just kept quiet, her fingers unconsciously intertwined with mine. I sat down next to the bed, not pulling my hand away. When Grace finally turned, her eyes met mine, deep, full of unnamed emotions. We were both silent, letting the heartbeat and the monitor speak for what couldn't be expressed in words. That moment lasted a few seconds, but it was enough for me to know she was gradually opening her heart. No need to say, "I love you." No need for promises. Just a handshake was enough. That evening, I asked Grace to go to the hospital yard. The sky was clear, the sky full of stars, like the previous picnic. But this time was different. There was no awkward distance. We sat on a bench under the oak tree. The night was so quiet that we could hear the wind blowing through the leaves. "Do you remember the first time we looked at the stars?" Grace asked, her voice soft, as if afraid to break the moment. "How could I forget?" I smiled softly. "That night, I realized I loved you," I said honestly, my voice calm, but my heart was beating fast. Grace turned to look at me, the moonlight reflected in her eyes sparkling like a lake. She didn't say anything, just looked. That look, long and deep, making all the surrounding sounds disappear. I moved closer slowly, enough for her to step back if she wanted to. But Grace didn't. She kept looking at me, her eyes trembling slightly, her lips parted in rapid breathing. When the distance was only a few centimeters, I asked softly, "Can I?" My voice was hoarse with excitement. Grace nodded slightly, just a slight nod, but enough to make my heart burst. The first kiss was gentle, clumsy, but sincere. Her lips were soft and warm, carrying the salty taste of tears that hadn't been wiped away. It wasn't a hasty kiss, but slow, hesitant, as if both were trying to touch something taboo, but had longed for so long. When we separated, we were still sitting close together, foreheads touching. Grace closed her eyes, letting out a soft sigh, a sigh that was both liberating and trembling. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'm scared." "I'm scared too," I replied, squeezing her hand gently. "But I'm more scared of missing you." Grace opened her eyes, looking at me, no longer avoiding. In her gaze, I saw the answer I was waiting for. She was no longer denying this feeling. That night, under the starry sky, all the age gaps, illnesses, fears, disappeared. There were only two people, a boy, a woman, loving each other in the most genuine way possible. Grace was discharged a week later. She was weaker than before, but the smile at the corners of her lips was warmer perhaps, because we had stopped avoiding affection. Still, the worry in her eyes was evident. One afternoon, as the sun was setting behind the pines, we sat on the porch. The flower garden we had both tended was in full bloom again, the scent of lavender wafting in the summer breeze. "Ethan," Grace said softly, her voice low but clear. "Are you sure? You want this?" she asked, her eyes fixed on me, a familiar struggle in them. "I've never been so sure," I said, my voice slow but firm. I looked deep into her eyes to show she wasn't lying. Grace sighed, her hands clasped together in her lap. "I'm 27 years older than you. I'm sick. And maybe," she hesitated, her throat tightening, "may not have much time left." "Do you think I don't know?" I smiled softly, but my voice was a little shaky. "Love is not measured in years, Grace. It is measured in every day, every moment we choose to spend together." She looked at me for a long time, tears welling up in the corners of her eyes. "Aren't you afraid of suffering?" Her voice was almost a whisper. "I'm only afraid of one thing," I replied, taking her hand. "Afraid of losing you." Grace trembled slightly, then finally, her hands clasped mine. "No more avoiding, no more hiding." "Okay," she said softly, her lips curving into a tearful smile. "Let's move forward together." I nodded, my heart pounding, but more peaceful than ever. A week later, the garden we planted together was the most brilliant it had ever been. Yellow sunflowers filled the sun, purple lavender covered the path. The old swing I had repainted white, swaying under the trees. Grace sat on the swing, her simple dress fluttering in the wind. She looked up at the sunset sky, where the last rays of the day were a mixture of orange-pink and pale purple. She looked so peaceful that I just wanted to hold this moment forever. I stood next to her, my hand gently placed on the chain, gently pushing the swing to swing. The chirping of insects in the garden mingled with the sound of the wind. In that moment, I told myself I don't know what the future will hold. Her illness, the age gap, the gossip out there, all are still there. But I know this right now. This is the most beautiful thing I have ever had, and that alone is enough for me to choose to move on. Thank you for listening to this story until the end. The story between Ethan and Grace may not be perfect. It may not follow the usual pattern of happiness, but it is proof that true love is not measured by age or time, but by the moment two people choose to be together, regardless of everything out there. If you have ever felt lost, ever been afraid to open your heart, remember sometimes the most beautiful things come when we least expect it. Just like Ethan found Grace, and Grace found herself again in Ethan's eyes. If this story touches your heart, subscribe to the Daily Unexpected Stories channel so you don't miss other emotional stories, where every day there is a surprise waiting for you. See you in the next story.